The bitter January wind howled across the Wyoming Territory like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of Thomas Blackwood's isolated ranch house as he stared into the crackling fire, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his calloused fingers. 7 years had passed since he'd buried his wife and unborn child. 7 years since he'd sworn never to let another person close enough to shatter what remained of his heart. It was 1885, and at 34 years old, Thomas had built a reputation as one of the most respected cattle ranchers in the territory and also as its most unapproachable bachelor. The locals in the growing town of Pine Ridge had long stopped trying to match him with eligible women. The last matchmaking attempt had ended with Thomas storming out of a social, leaving behind whispers and pitying glances that followed him like shadows. "Damn fool notion," he muttered to the empty room, taking another burning swig. His faithful cattle dog, Rusty, whined softly from his place by the fire. Tomorrow would bring another day of backbreaking work, another sunrise he'd face alone just as he preferred it. But fate, as Thomas would soon discover, had other plans entirely. 20 miles away in Pine Ridge, Faith Daniels stepped off the stagecoach, her gloved hand clutching a letter of appointment that had brought her all the way from Boston. At 26, she was determined to make a new beginning as the town's schoolteacher. After losing her fiancé to typhoid fever 2 years prior, the opportunity to leave behind the sympathetic glances and well-meaning but painful inquiries about her future had been too tempting to resist. Miss Daniels, a portly man with a friendly face, approached, extending his hand. "Mayor Wilson." "Welcome to Pine Ridge. How was your journey?" Faith smiled, trying to hide her exhaustion. "Long, but worth every mile if it brings me to my new home," the mayor beamed. "That's the spirit. The town is mighty excited to have a proper schoolteacher. Our last one left us 6 months ago, couldn't handle frontier life." He cleared his throat. "I trust you're made of sterner stuff." "I believe I am," Faith replied, her chin lifting slightly. She'd come too far to turn back now. The schoolhouse was modest but charming, with a small attached living quarters that, while simple, offered more privacy than she'd expected. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, waiting to warm the classroom during the frigid Wyoming winter. "School begins next Monday," Mayor Wilson explained. "That gives you a few days to settle in and meet the community. 23 children are enrolled, ages 5 to 16. After the mayor left, Faith unpacked her meager possessions: books, clothing, a photograph of her parents, and a few cherished keepsakes. As night fell, she sat by the window, watching snowflakes begin to dance in the lantern light outside. "A new beginning," she whispered to herself, wondering if she would find peace in this wild, untamed place. The following morning, Thomas rode into town for supplies, his mood as dark as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The general store was his first stop, where he handed his list to the proprietor, Harold Jenkins. "Morning, Thomas," Harold said cheerfully. "Heard we got our new schoolteacher yesterday. Pretty young thing from back east." Thomas grunted noncommittally. "Town's having a welcome social for her tomorrow evening at the church," Harold continued, undeterred by Thomas's lack of enthusiasm. "You ought to come." "Got cattle to tend," Thomas replied curtly, drumming his fingers on the counter as Harold gathered his supplies. Harold's wife, Martha, emerged from the back room. "Thomas Blackwood, you haven't attended a social in years. Would it kill you to be neighborly for one evening?" Before Thomas could respond, the bell above the door jingled and a woman entered, bringing with her a gust of cold air and the faint scent of lavender. Thomas turned, intending to make a quick exit, but found himself frozen in place. The newcomer wore a practical blue dress and a matching bonnet that framed a face both delicate and determined. Her eyes, the color of summer skies, met his briefly before she smiled at the shopkeepers. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Faith Daniels, the new teacher." Martha rushed forward, taking Faith's hands. "Welcome, dear. We're so pleased to have you. Have you met Thomas Blackwood? He owns the largest cattle ranch in the county." Faith turned toward him, extending her hand. "A pleasure, Mr. Blackwood." Thomas stared at her outstretched hand as if it were a rattlesnake. After an awkward moment, he nodded stiffly and mumbled, "Miss Daniels, before grabbing his supplies and heading for the door. "Don't mind him," he heard Martha say as the door closed behind him. "He wasn't always so gruff." Life's dealt him some hard blows. Thomas mounted his horse, irritated at Martha's gossip and even more irritated at his own rudeness. Something about the schoolteacher's direct gaze had unsettled him, stirring memories he'd worked hard to bury. Faith, meanwhile, was puzzled by the rancher's abrupt departure. "I seem to have offended Mr. Blackwood somehow," she remarked. Martha patted her arm. "Not at all, dear. Thomas keeps to himself these days. Tragic story, lost his wife and unborn child to childbed fever 7 years back. Hasn't been the same since." "How terrible," Faith murmured, feeling a pang of sympathy. She knew all too well the crushing weight of loss. "He was different before," Harold added, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Friendly, always ready with a joke or a helping hand. Sarah's death changed him. Now he works from sunup to sundown, barely speaks to anyone unless necessary." Faith nodded, understanding the impulse to withdraw from the world when it had taken too much from you. Hadn't she done the same in Boston after William died? The difference was, she'd eventually recognized the danger in isolating herself with her grief. The welcome social the following evening was a lively affair. Faith met most of her future students and their parents, memorizing names and faces while answering countless questions about life in the East. Mayor Wilson introduced her to the town doctor, the Reverend, and various business owners, all of whom expressed delight at having a qualified teacher for their children. Midway through the evening, Faith stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. She inhaled deeply, appreciating the crisp, clean scent of pine and snow so different from Boston's smoky city air. "Too crowded in there for you?" a deep voice asked, startling her. Faith turned to find Thomas Blackwood leaning against the church wall, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged. "I didn't expect to see you here. I was told you avoid town gatherings." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I do." Martha Jenkins has a way of making a man feel guilty for his antisocial tendencies. Faith laughed softly. "She does seem formidable." "Formidable is putting it mildly," Thomas replied, surprising himself with the ease of conversation. "She once tracked me down at my ranch to deliver a pie and a lecture on the importance of community involvement. And did her lecture take? Evidently not, since this is the first social I've attended in years." He studied her for a moment. "What brings a Boston lady to Wyoming Territory?" "Pine Ridge isn't exactly the cultural center of the West." Faith turned her gaze back to the stars. "I wanted a fresh start. Sometimes the places that hold our memories become too heavy to bear." Thomas felt a jolt of recognition at her words. "You're running from something," he said, more statement than question. "Not running from," she corrected gently. "Moving toward, there's a difference." Before he could respond, the church door opened, spilling light and noise into the quiet night. "Faith, are you out here?" called Mayor Wilson. "The children want to sing for you." "Coming," Faith replied, then turned back to Thomas. "It was nice speaking with you, Mr. Blackwood. I hope to see you again." Thomas watched her return to the warmth and light of the social, feeling oddly bereft in the darkness. He hadn't planned to speak to her at all, had only come to the social because Martha had indeed tracked him down that morning, insisting his absence would be an insult to the new teacher. He'd intended to make a brief appearance and leave, but something had kept him lingering outside, and now he found himself unsettled by their brief exchange. "Moving toward, not running from," he muttered to himself as he mounted his horse for the long ride home. The concept seemed foreign after years of deliberately avoiding anything that might bring change to his carefully controlled existence. The first day of school arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and temperatures cold enough to freeze breath. Faith rose before dawn to light the stove in the schoolhouse, determined to have the room warm and welcoming for her students. By 8 o'clock, children began arriving, their faces ranging from excited to apprehensive. Faith had prepared diligently, organizing students by age and ability. The morning passed in a whirlwind of introductions, assessments, and establishing rules. By noon, she had identified her most advanced students, her most challenging ones, and those who would need extra attention. Among them was 10-year-old Daniel Parker, a quiet boy with intelligent eyes who she discovered could barely read despite his obvious brightness. When she gently asked why he hadn't learned, he ducked his head. "Pa says reading's not important for ranch work," he mumbled. "Says it's a waste of time." Faith knelt beside his desk. "Daniel, reading opens doors to worlds beyond Wyoming. It's never a waste of time." The boy looked unconvinced but nodded politely. After school, Faith was tidying the classroom when the door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air. She looked up, surprised to find Thomas Blackwood filling the doorway, his imposing figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him. "This is unexpected." Thomas removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "Miss Daniels." "I've come about a problem." Faith set down the books she'd been organizing. "What problem might that be?" "Jacob Miller's boy broke his leg yesterday. Jacob asked if I'd deliver this to you." He held out a folded note. "He works for me as a ranch hand." Faith took the note, which explained that 12-year-old Timothy Miller would be absent for several weeks while his broken leg healed. "Thank you for bringing this. It was kind of you to serve as messenger." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Wasn't out of my way." An awkward silence fell between them until Faith spoke again. "Do you have children attending school, Mr. Blackwood?" A shadow crossed his face. "No, I see," Faith said, remembering what Martha had told her about his loss. "Well, I appreciate you taking the time to deliver the message." Thomas nodded, replacing his hat. He turned to leave but paused at the door. "How was your first day?" The question seemed to surprise them both. "Challenging," Faith admitted with a small smile, "but rewarding. The children are eager to learn, though some need more encouragement than others." "Like who?" Thomas asked, his interest seeming genuine. "Daniel Parker, for one, bright boy, but his father apparently doesn't see the value in education." Thomas's expression darkened. "Frank Parker, he works his boy like a grown man, barely lets him attend school as it is. That's a shame." "Daniel has potential. Frank's short-handed since his wife died last winter. Not that it excuses neglecting the boy's education," Thomas added, his tone suggesting personal disapproval. Faith studied him thoughtfully. "Mr. Blackwood, you seem to have strong opinions about education for someone with no children in school." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "My wife was a reader, loved books, believed education was the path to a better life." He spoke the words stiffly, as if they were being pulled from him against his will. "She sounds like a wise woman," Faith said softly. Thomas's eyes met hers, and for a moment Faith glimpsed raw pain behind his guarded expression. Then the moment passed and his face closed again. "Good day, Miss Daniels," he said abruptly, turning to leave. "Good day, Mr. Blackwood." As winter deepened, Faith settled into a routine. Mornings and afternoons were devoted to teaching, evenings to lesson preparation and grading. Weekends brought social calls and church services, where she gradually became acquainted with the townspeople. She found herself welcomed with open arms, invited to Sunday dinners and quilting circles, though she often sensed a careful avoidance of her past when conversation turned personal. Daniel Parker continued to struggle with reading, though his determination impressed Faith. One Friday afternoon, as most children hurried home, Daniel lingered, reluctantly explaining that his father was in town and wouldn't return to collect him until later. "Then we have time for extra reading practice," Faith suggested, earning a resigned sigh from the boy. They worked for an hour before the schoolhouse door opened. Faith looked up, expecting Frank Parker, but instead found Thomas Blackwood stamping snow from his boots. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, surprised by his third visit in as many weeks. Since delivering Jacob Miller's note, he'd returned once to fix the schoolhouse door, which had been sticking, and again to deliver firewood when supplies ran low during a particularly cold spell. "Miss Daniels," he nodded, then noticed Daniel. "Parker, your father sent me to fetch you. He's indisposed." Faith interpreted indisposed to mean drunk, judging by Thomas's disapproving tone. Daniel gathered his things quickly. "Thank you for the extra help, Miss Daniels." You're making progress, Daniel. Keep practicing, Faith encouraged. After the boy left to wait by Thomas's wagon, the rancher lingered. Teaching him to read, Faith nodded. He's bright but behind his peers. His father doesn't value book learning. I know Frank's views. Thomas frowned. The boy deserves better. All children deserve an education, Faith agreed. Would you like some coffee, Mr. Blackwood? It's a cold ride back to your ranch. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Much obliged. Faith poured coffee from the pot she kept warming on the stove, watching as Thomas removed his gloves and warmed his hands around the cup. His hands were large and work-roughened, bearing the marks of a man who didn't shy away from physical labor. You've been in Pine Ridge for over a month now, Thomas observed. Finding it to your liking? Very much, Faith replied. The people have been kind, the children eager to learn. It's different from Boston, of course, but in good ways. And what did you leave behind in Boston? Thomas asked, his direct gaze making evasion difficult. Faith hesitated. Family, friends, a life that no longer fit. Because of the fiancé who died, Thomas said bluntly. Faith's eyes widened. How did you small towns have big ears, Miss Daniels? Martha Jenkins mentioned it. I see. Faith set down her cup. Yes, my fiancé William died of typhoid 2 years ago. We were to be married that spring. Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. And you came west to escape the memories. Not to escape them, Faith corrected, echoing their conversation from the social. To make new ones. William's death taught me life is too short to spend it dwelling on what might have been. Thomas's jaw tightened. Some losses change a person fundamentally. There's no moving forward from them. I disagree, Faith said gently. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting or diminishing what was lost. It means finding a way to carry that loss while still embracing life. Pretty words, Thomas said, an edge of bitterness in his voice. Easier said than lived. Faith met his gaze steadily. I never said it was easy, Mr. Blackwood, only necessary. The rancher drained his coffee and stood. I should get the Parker boy home before dark. Of course, thank you for the company. At the door, Thomas paused. Miss Daniels, there's a blizzard coming. Weather like that, supplies can run short. If you need anything firewood, food, send word to my ranch. It's closer than town. The offer surprised her. That's very kind. Neighborly, he corrected, as if kindness was an accusation. Nothing more, Faith smiled. Neighborly then, thank you. After Thomas left, Faith found herself thinking about their conversation. There was something compelling about the taciturn rancher, perhaps the glimpses of the man he'd once been, visible in rare moments when his guard slipped. She wondered if he ever tired of the isolation he'd imposed upon himself. The predicted blizzard arrived 3 days later, howling down from the mountains with ferocious intensity. School was canceled as roads became impassable and temperatures plummeted. Faith remained in her small quarters, rationing firewood and reading by lamplight as wind rattled the windows and snow piled against the walls. On the 3rd day, as Faith contemplated the dwindling stack of firewood, a pounding at the door startled her. She opened it to find Thomas, his face half hidden by a snow-crusted scarf, arms loaded with firewood. Mr. Blackwood, she exclaimed, stepping back to let him enter. How did you get here in this weather? Thomas deposited the wood beside the stove. Snowshoes and determination brought supplies. He gestured to a sack hanging from his shoulder. Food, matches, lamp oil. You traveled 3 miles in a blizzard to bring me supplies, Faith asked, astonished. Mayor Wilson asked me to check on you, Thomas said, though Faith suspected this wasn't entirely true. Said the schoolteacher quarters weren't well stocked for extended storms. Well, I'm very grateful, Faith said, taking the sack and unpacking bread, jerky, potatoes, and canned goods. Would you like coffee or something to eat before you head back? Thomas glanced at the window, where snow continued to swirl violently. Might wait for the worst to pass, he conceded, removing his heavy coat and scarf. Faith busied herself preparing coffee and heating a simple stew with some of the provisions he'd brought. They ate in companionable silence, the howling wind the only sound until Faith spoke. How are your cattle faring in this weather? Brought the vulnerable ones into the barn before the storm hit. The rest are hardy enough if they can find shelter in the trees. Thomas sipped his coffee. Lost some last winter to a storm like this. Learned my lesson. You manage the ranch alone, Faith asked. Have 3 hands year-round, more during calving and branding seasons. He studied her across the table. You ask a lot of questions, Miss Daniels, Faith smiled. I'm a teacher. Curiosity is an occupational requirement. Something resembling amusement flickered in Thomas's eyes. Fair enough. How long have you had your ranch? She asked, encouraged by his willingness to talk. 15 years. Came west at 19, worked other men's land until I could buy my own. Pride colored his voice. Started with 50 acres and 20 head of cattle. Now it's 2,000 acres and over 500 head. That's impressive, Faith said sincerely. You've built something remarkable. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Hard work, that's all. And vision, Faith added. Not everyone can see possibilities where others see only wilderness. Thomas looked at her thoughtfully. You have an optimistic view of things, Miss Daniels. Faith, she said impulsively. After you've braved a blizzard to bring me supplies, I think you've earned the right to use my given name. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Faith, he said, the single syllable sounding strange on his lips. And I suppose you should call me Thomas, though most folks around here don't. What do they call you? Blackwood, mostly. Or that ornery rancher, he added with a hint of self-deprecation. Faith laughed. Well, Thomas, I'm finding it difficult to reconcile the ornery rancher with the man who trudged through a blizzard to deliver firewood to a relative stranger. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, standing to check the storm through the window. Storm's letting up. I should head back before it gets dark. Faith rose as well, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. Thank you again for the supplies. It was thoughtful. Thomas donned his coat and scarf, avoiding her gaze. Think nothing of it. At the door he paused. The storm should blow itself out by morning. If school resumes, be careful on the road. Drifts can be deceptive. I will, Faith promised. After he left, Faith stood at the window, watching his tall figure disappear into the swirling snow. There was more to Thomas Blackwood than the town gossip suggested. More warmth, more complexity, more pain carefully hidden beneath his gruff exterior. The blizzard finally abated, leaving Pine Ridge buried under 4 feet of snow. School remained closed for another week as roads were cleared and families dug themselves out. Faith used the time to prepare lessons and catch up on correspondence with her family in Boston. She found herself strangely missing Thomas's unexpected visit, the brief connection they'd shared over coffee and conversation. When school resumed, Faith noticed Daniel Parker's absence immediately. As days passed with no word from the Parker ranch, she became concerned. After Friday's dismissal, she approached Mayor Wilson about her worries. Frank Parker's place is isolated, the mayor explained. Might still be snowed in, or the boy could be sick. Lot of influenza going around after that storm. Perhaps someone should check on them, Faith suggested. The mayor shook his head. Roads to the Parker place are likely still impassable. We'll give it a few more days. Unsatisfied with this response, Faith made a decision. The following morning, Saturday, she borrowed a horse from the livery and set out for the Parker ranch, following directions provided by a reluctant liveryman who thought her mission foolhardy. The journey proved more difficult than anticipated. Though the main roads had been cleared, the trail to the Parker ranch remained largely untouched, forcing Faith to dismount several times to lead her horse through deep drifts. By the time the small, ramshackle cabin came into view, her boots were soaked and her fingers numb despite thick gloves. As she approached, she noticed the absence of smoke from the chimney troubling in such cold weather. She tied her horse to a post and knocked on the door. When no one answered, she tried the handle and found it unlocked. "Hello, Mr. Parker. Daniel," she called, pushing the door open. The cabin was frigid inside, the fireplace cold. Faith moved through the small space with growing concern until she reached a back room where she found Daniel huddled under blankets, his face flushed with fever. "Daniel," she exclaimed, rushing to his side. "Where's your father?" "Went for medicine," the boy rasped. 3 days ago, hasn't come back." Faith felt his forehead burning hot. "How long have you been sick?" "Since the storm," Daniel whispered. "Pa got sick first, then me. He went for the doctor when I got worse." Faith's mind raced. If Frank Parker had left 3 days ago and not returned, something had happened to him. Meanwhile, Daniel needed immediate medical attention. "I'm going to get you help," she promised, tucking the blankets more securely around him. "Can you sit up? Drink some water?" Daniel nodded weakly. Faith found a cup and filled it from a bucket of water that sat, partially frozen, by the cold stove. After helping him drink, she built a fire in the stove, grateful for her childhood summers spent at her grandparents' farm where such skills had been necessary. "I need to get you to town to the doctor," Faith explained once the cabin began to warm, "but I don't think you can ride alone." Daniel's eyes widened with fear. "Are you leaving?" "No," Faith assured him, "but I need to get help, someone stronger than me who can carry you if necessary." The nearest neighbor was Thomas Blackwood's ranch, she realized. The liveryman had mentioned it was just 2 miles east of the Parkers' property. "Daniel, I'm going to ride to Mr. Blackwood's ranch for help. I'll be back as quickly as possible. Can you stay awake until then?" The boy nodded bravely. Faith added more wood to the stove, made sure water was within his reach, then reluctantly left, mounting her horse for the ride to Thomas's ranch. The journey seemed endless, but finally, she crested a hill and saw the Blackwood ranch spread before her, a large, well-built house, a substantial barn, and several outbuildings, all showing signs of prosperity and care that the Parker place lacked. As she approached, a dog began barking. Thomas emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, clearly not expecting visitors. When he recognized her, his expression shifted from wariness to concern. "Faith, what in God's name are you doing out here?" Faith dismounted, her legs stiff with cold. "It's Daniel Parker. He's sick, burning with fever." "His father went for the doctor 3 days ago and never returned." Thomas's face darkened. "Damn fool probably got himself lost or fell into a ravine. He drinks too much to be traveling in these conditions." "Daniel needs help," Faith pressed. "I can't transport him alone." Without hesitation, Thomas turned to one of his ranch hands who had appeared at the barn door. "Peterson, saddle my horse and get the sled ready. Tell Walker to ride to town for the doctor." To Faith, he added, "Come inside while we prepare. You look half frozen." The warmth of Thomas's house enveloped Faith as she stepped inside. It was larger than she'd expected, solidly built and surprisingly comfortable, with well-crafted furniture and shelves lined with books more than she'd seen in any house in Pine Ridge. "You read," she observed, moving to examine the titles while Thomas gathered supplies. "Sarah did," Thomas replied, his voice tight. "I kept her books." Faith turned to find him watching her, his expression a mixture of pain and something else she couldn't identify. "I'm sorry." "I didn't mean to pry." Thomas shook his head. "It's been 7 years, shouldn't still feel like yesterday." He handed her a cup of hot coffee. "Drink this while I get ready." 20 minutes later, they were on their way to the Parker ranch, Thomas driving a horse-drawn sled with Faith beside him. They found Daniel semi-conscious, his fever higher than when Faith had left. Thomas lifted the boy as if he weighed nothing, wrapping him in blankets before carrying him to the sled. "We'll take him to my place," he decided. "It's closer and the doctor will find us there more easily." The return journey was tense, with Daniel drifting in and out of consciousness. At the ranch, Thomas carried him to a spare bedroom while Faith removed the boy's damp clothes and tucked him into the dry, warm bed. "What else can we do?" Faith asked as Thomas brought fresh water and cloths. "Cool him down," Thomas replied, demonstrating by wringing out a cloth and placing it on Daniel's forehead. "My mother used to do this when I had fevers as a boy." They worked together, changing the cloths as they warmed, coaxing Daniel to drink small sips of water. Faith was struck by Thomas's gentle handling of the sick child, so at odds with his usual gruff demeanor. "You're good with him," she observed softly. Thomas's hands stilled momentarily. "Had practice. Sarah was ill for weeks before." He didn't finish the sentence. Faith placed her hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Thomas." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without looking up. "Doctor should be here soon." The afternoon stretched into evening with no sign of the doctor. Daniel's fever remained dangerously high despite their efforts. As darkness fell, Thomas lit lamps and built up the fire in the bedroom's small stove. "You should eat something," he told Faith. "Kitchen's stocked, help yourself." Faith shook her head. "I'm not hungry. You've been here all day without food." "Won't do the boy any good if you collapse from hunger." Thomas insisted. "I'll stay with him." Reluctantly, Faith went to the kitchen where she found bread, cheese, and cold meat. She made sandwiches for both of them, carrying Thomas's back to the sick room. "Any change?" she asked, handing him the food. "No," Thomas took the sandwich with a nod of thanks. "But he's young and strong. He'll fight through this." They ate in silence, taking turns bathing Daniel's face and neck with cool cloths. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves of the house. "Another storm coming," Thomas observed grimly, "may delay the doctor." Faith looked up in alarm. "But Daniel needs medical attention. His fever isn't breaking." "We'll do what we can," Thomas said firmly. "I've seen people through fevers before." As if to confirm his fears about the weather, snow began falling heavily, visible through the window in the glow of the porch lantern. By midnight, it was clear the doctor wouldn't arrive before morning, if then. "You should get some rest," Thomas told Faith. "There's another bedroom across the hall. I'll wake you if there's any change." Faith shook her head. "I'll stay. You're the one who should rest. You've been working since dawn." Thomas studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, but there was no real irritation in his tone. "I've been called worse," Faith replied with a small smile. Thomas's lips quirked in response. "I imagine you have." He settled into a chair beside the bed. "We'll both stay then." As the night deepened, Daniel's fever finally began to break. By dawn, his forehead was merely warm rather than burning, and his breathing had eased. Faith, who had dozed off in her chair, woke to find Thomas checking the boy's pulse, his face lined with fatigue but relieved. "His fever's down," Thomas whispered. "He's sleeping naturally now." Faith sagged with relief. "Thank God." Thomas stood, stretching his tall frame. "Come, you need proper rest and I need coffee." In the kitchen, Thomas moved with practiced efficiency, stoking the stove and setting water to boil. Faith watched him, struck by the contrast between this capable, caring man and the bitter recluse the townspeople described. "Why does everyone think you're so unapproachable?" she asked suddenly. Thomas froze momentarily, then continued measuring coffee grounds. "Because I prefer it that way." "Do you?" Faith pressed. "Or is it just easier than letting people close enough to matter?" Thomas turned to face her, his expression guarded. "You're direct, Miss Daniels." "Faith," she corrected. "And yes, I am. Life's too short for anything else." "Is that why you came west? To be direct and ask uncomfortable questions of unsuspecting ranchers?" There was an edge to his voice, but also something else, a reluctant admiration, perhaps. Faith smiled tiredly. "I came west to live, Thomas. Not just exist." Thomas poured coffee into 2 mugs, handing one to Faith. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a brief contact that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through Faith's hand. "And are you living?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "I'm trying," Faith replied honestly. "Some days are easier than others. But yes, I believe I am." Thomas nodded slowly. "Good." The single word carried weight beyond its simplicity. They drank their coffee in companionable silence until a knock at the door announced the doctor's arrival. Dr. Reynolds, a no-nonsense man in his 50s, examined Daniel thoroughly before pronouncing him past the worst danger. "He'll need rest and good food for at least a week," the doctor advised. "And news of his father, any word?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing." "I'll send my men to search once the weather clears." "I'd best get back to town," Dr. Reynolds said, packing his bag. "More patients waiting. Miss Daniels, do you need a ride?" Faith glanced at Daniel, then at Thomas. "If it's all right, I'd like to stay until Daniel's stronger." Thomas looked surprised but nodded. "Of course." After the doctor left, Faith returned to Daniel's side, finding him awake and alert enough to take some broth Thomas had prepared. As she helped him eat, Thomas watched from the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "You're good with children," he observed when Daniel had fallen back asleep. Faith smiled. "I should hope so, given my profession." "It's more than training," Thomas said. "It's natural for you." There was something in his tone that made Faith look up sharply. "Thomas," he cleared his throat. "Sarah and we wanted children, several of them, when she died." He trailed off, the pain evident in his voice. Faith's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry." Thomas nodded once, then straightened. "I need to check on the cattle. Will you be all right with Daniel?" "Of course," Faith assured him. Thomas disappeared for several hours, returning with snow dusting his coat and hat. Faith had used the time to tidy the sick room and kitchen, feeling strangely comfortable in the rancher's home despite the circumstances that had brought her there. "Weather's clearing," Thomas reported. "Sent 2 men to search for Frank Parker." "Thank you," Faith said, "for everything you've done for Daniel, for letting us impose on your home." Thomas removed his coat, hanging it by the door. "It's no imposition." That evening, after Daniel had been settled for the night, Faith and Thomas sat before the fire in the main room. Thomas had surprised her by producing a chessboard, explaining that he sometimes played against himself on long winter evenings. "Sounds lonely," Faith observed as they set up the pieces. Thomas shrugged. "Keeps the mind sharp." He gestured for her to make the first move. As they played, Faith found herself studying Thomas's face in the firelight, the strong lines of his jaw, the furrow between his brows that deepened when he concentrated, the way his eyes reflected the dancing flames. There was a quiet dignity to him, a solidity that she found increasingly attractive. "Check," Thomas said, interrupting her thoughts. Faith refocused on the board, seeing her precarious position. "You're very good." "Sarah taught me," Thomas said, the mention of his wife's name coming more easily now. "She was better, never let me win even when I complained." Faith smiled, making a defensive move. "She sounds like a woman of principle." "She was." Thomas studied the board. "You would have liked her." "She valued education too, taught reading to several ranch hands who'd never had schooling." "I wish I could have known her," Faith said sincerely. Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze. "So do I." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken thoughts. Then Thomas returned his attention to the game, but something had shifted, some barrier lowered. They played until Faith could barely keep her eyes open. Thomas showed her to the guest room, hesitating at the door. "Thank you for staying with Daniel," he said, "and for the company." Faith smiled sleepily. "Thank you for the chess game, and for not being as ornery as your reputation suggests." A corner of Thomas's mouth lifted. "Don't tell anyone, I have a reputation to maintain." Faith laughed softly. "Your secret is safe with me." The next morning, Thomas's men returned with grim news. They had found Frank Parker's body in a ravine, his horse nearby with a broken leg. The man had apparently fallen while riding during the storm, breaking his neck in the process. Thomas delivered the news to Faith privately before they told Daniel. "The boy's an orphan now," he said heavily. "No family that I know of." Faith's heart sank. "What will happen to him?" "Mayor Wilson will have to decide. Might be the orphanage in Cheyenne." "No," Faith said firmly. "Daniel belongs in Pine Ridge with people who know him. There must be a family willing to take him in." Thomas regarded her thoughtfully. "You've grown attached to the boy, haven't you?" Faith challenged. Thomas didn't answer directly. "Let's tell him together," he suggested instead. Daniel took the news with a stoicism that broke Faith's heart, the reaction of a child who had already endured too much loss. When he finally cried, it was Thomas who sat beside him, a strong hand on the boy's shoulder, offering silent comfort while Faith held his hand. Later, Thomas found Faith in the kitchen, wiping away her own tears. "You're thinking about taking him in yourself," Thomas said, not a question but an observation. Faith nodded. "My quarters at the schoolhouse are small, but we could manage. He needs stability, education. I could give him that." "A single woman adopting a boy his age, people would talk," Thomas warned. Faith lifted her chin. "Let them. I've never much cared for gossip." Thomas studied her, admiration evident in his gaze. "No, I don't suppose you do." He hesitated, then added, "There's another option. He could stay here." Faith's eyes widened. "Here with you?" "I need help around the ranch. Boy his age should be learning a trade. I could teach him ranching, make sure he continues his schooling." Thomas spoke matter-of-factly, but Faith sensed the offer wasn't made lightly. "That's very generous," Faith said, genuinely surprised. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "Practical. Ranch this size will need a successor someday." Faith smiled, seeing through his attempt at detachment. "Of course, purely practical." Thomas gave her a look that acknowledged her gentle teasing. "We should ask the boy what he wants." Daniel, to Faith's surprise, immediately accepted Thomas's offer. "I can really stay here, learn to be a rancher, if that's what you want," Thomas confirmed. "But you'll continue your schooling too. No arguments." Daniel nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. The matter settled, Faith prepared to return to town the following day. Thomas insisted on driving her himself, despite her protests that his men could handle it. Need to speak with Mayor Wilson about Daniel anyway, he said, brooking no argument. The journey to town was peaceful, the countryside transformed into a sparkling wonderland by recent snow. Faith found herself reluctant for the ride to end, aware that once back in Pine Ridge, her time with Thomas would necessarily be limited by their respective responsibilities. Will you bring Daniel to school when he's well enough? She asked as the town came into view. Of course, Thomas replied. Made a promise, didn't I? Faith smiled. You did, and something tells me Thomas Blackwood doesn't break his promises. Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening. Not intentionally, no. In town, Thomas helped Faith down from the wagon in front of the schoolhouse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. The contact sent a flutter through Faith's stomach that she tried to ignore. Thank you again, she said, suddenly shy, for everything. Thomas nodded, looking as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. I'll see you soon, he finally managed, when I bring Daniel to school. Faith watched him drive away, a curious mix of emotions swirling within her. In just a few days, Thomas Blackwood had transformed from a taciturn stranger to something else entirely, someone whose presence she missed as soon as it was gone. The following weeks brought significant changes to Pine Ridge. News of Frank Parker's death and Thomas Blackwood's decision to take in Daniel spread quickly, generating considerable gossip. Faith found herself fielding curious questions from students and parents alike, some well-meaning, others thinly veiled attempts to extract juicy details about the reclusive rancher's sudden change of heart. True to his word, Thomas brought Daniel to school once the boy had fully recovered. Faith was pleased to see Daniel looking healthy and more confident, chatting animatedly about life on the ranch as he settled into his desk. Thomas lingered after the other parents had departed. He's been practicing his reading, he told Faith. Every evening after chores, Faith smiled. That's wonderful. I've noticed improvement already. He talks about you constantly, Thomas added. Miss Daniels this, Miss Daniels that. Thought you should know you've made quite an impression. Faith felt a blush rise to her cheeks. He's a special boy. I'm glad he's found a home with you. Thomas nodded, twisting his hat in his hands. Sunday's the spring social at the church, he said abruptly. Daniel's looking forward to it. Yes, my students have been excited about it for weeks, Faith replied. Thomas cleared his throat. Thought I might attend with Daniel. He paused, then added, would be nice to see you there. The invitation, indirect as it was, surprised and pleased Faith. I'll be there, she assured him. Helping with the refreshments, I believe. Thomas nodded, seeming satisfied. Good, well, I should get back to the ranch. Cattle don't feed themselves. Faith watched him leave, a smile playing at her lips. Thomas Blackwood, attending a social voluntarily, wonders never ceased. The spring social was a colorful affair, with tables laden with food, fiddle music for dancing, and the entire community turned out in their Sunday best. Faith wore her nicest dress, a blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and found herself scanning the crowd for Thomas more often than she cared to admit. He arrived late, Daniel bouncing with excitement beside him. Thomas had clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and newly pressed trousers, his dark hair slicked back neatly. He looked handsome, Faith realized with a start, not conventionally so, perhaps, but with a rugged appeal that drew her eye. Throughout the afternoon, Thomas remained on the periphery of the gathering, occasionally speaking with other ranchers but mostly watching Daniel interact with his schoolmates. Faith was kept busy serving refreshments and chatting with parents, but she was acutely aware of Thomas's presence, his gaze finding her across the crowded churchyard with increasing frequency. As the sun began to set, the fiddler struck up a lively tune for dancing. Couples formed circles and lines, laughing as they moved through the steps. Faith stood watching, clapping in time to the music, when she felt someone approach from behind. Would you care to dance, Miss Daniels? Faith turned to find Thomas standing closer than she'd expected, his expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, taking his offered hand. Thomas led her to the edge of the dancing area. "Should warn you been a long time since I danced," he admitted quietly. "It's like riding a horse," Faith assured him with a smile. "Your body remembers." And indeed, after a few tentative moments, Thomas moved with surprising grace for such a tall man. His hand at her waist was warm and steady, his steps becoming more confident as the music continued. Faith found herself laughing with pure enjoyment as he twirled her, the motion sending her skirts swirling around her ankles. "You dance very well for a man who claims to be out of practice," she teased when the music paused. Thomas's lips curved in a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the habitual sternness. "Good partner," he replied simply. They danced 3 more times before Daniel interrupted, tugging at Thomas's sleeve to show him a wooden carving he'd won in a children's game. As Thomas bent to examine the boy's prize, Faith noticed Martha Jenkins watching them with undisguised interest from across the yard. "I believe we're causing a sensation," Faith murmured when Thomas straightened. Thomas followed her gaze, his expression darkening slightly as he noted the curious onlookers. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "People talking," Faith shook her head. "Not if it doesn't bother you." Thomas studied her face for a moment, then surprised her by offering his arm. "In that case, would you walk with me? Getting a bit crowded here." They strolled to the edge of the churchyard, where a stand of cottonwoods provided shade and a measure of privacy. Daniel had rejoined his friends, engrossed in a game of marbles. "He seems happy," Faith observed, watching the boy laugh at something another child said. "He is," Thomas agreed, "settling in well, quick learner with the ranch work and his studies." "You're good for him," Faith said softly. "He needed stability, guidance." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Never thought I'd have a child in my house again," he admitted. "After Sarah died, I couldn't imagine it." Faith turned to face him. "Yet here you are." "Here I am," Thomas echoed, his gaze intent on her face. "Seems I'm doing a lot of things I never thought I'd do again. Like dancing at socials," Faith suggested with a small smile. "Like feeling something other than grief," Thomas corrected, his voice low. "You asked me once if I preferred being unapproachable. Truth is, I didn't prefer it, I just didn't know how to be anything else anymore." Faith's heart quickened at his words. "And now," Thomas took a step closer. "Now I find myself wondering what Sarah would think of how I've spent these past 7 years, shut away bitter." He shook his head. "She'd be disappointed. I think she'd understand," Faith said gently. "Grief doesn't follow rules or timelines." "Maybe," Thomas conceded, "but she'd also tell me it was time to stop using her memory as an excuse to avoid living." He met Faith's gaze directly. "That's what you've been telling me too, isn't it? In your way." Faith nodded, unable to look away from the intensity in his eyes. "Everyone deserves happiness, Thomas, even those who have lost it once, even stubborn ranchers who push away anyone who tries to get close." He asked, a hint of self-deprecation in his tone. "Especially them," Faith replied with a soft smile. Thomas hesitated, then reached out to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. "Faith, Mr. Blackwood," Daniel's voice interrupted the moment. The boy ran toward them, excited. "They're about to start the pie auction. Miss Daniels, did you bring a pie? Mr. Blackwood makes really good apple pies, he could have brought one." Thomas dropped his hand, looking both frustrated and amused by the interruption. "No, Daniel, I didn't bring a pie to be auctioned." "Well, come on then, we need to bid on one." Daniel tugged at Thomas's arm. Faith laughed at the boy's enthusiasm. "You'd better go. Pie auctions are serious business in Pine Ridge." Thomas gave her a look that suggested their conversation wasn't finished, then allowed himself to be pulled back toward the social by an eager Daniel. Faith followed more slowly, her cheek still warm where Thomas had touched it, her mind replaying his words. The pie auction was a traditional highlight of the spring social, with ladies contributing their best baking to be auctioned off to the highest bidder, the proceeds going to the church fund. Faith hadn't contributed a pie, still not confident in her baking skills with the temperamental wood stoves of the West. To her surprise, Thomas bid on and won a cherry pie baked by the mayor's wife, paying considerably more than the pie was worth and causing a stir among the onlookers. Even more surprising was his actions afterward when he approached Faith with the pie in hand. "Thought you might like to share this," he said, ignoring the whispers his gesture provoked. "Unless you prefer apple," Faith smiled, touched by the public gesture. "Cherry is perfect." They found a quiet spot at one of the tables, Daniel joining them with a plate of cookies he'd acquired. As they shared the pie, Faith became aware of Martha Jenkins approaching with determined steps. "Thomas Blackwood," Martha declared, hands on her ample hips. "You haven't attended a social in years, and suddenly you're dancing and bidding on pies like a man half your age. What's gotten into you?" Thomas regarded her calmly. "Just enjoying the day, Martha. Fine social you've organized." Martha's gaze shifted between Thomas and Faith, a knowing smile spreading across her face. "MMHMM. Well, it's about time you rejoined the living. Sarah would approve." After Martha bustled away, Faith bit her lip to suppress a laugh at Thomas's discomfited expression. "I warned you we were causing a sensation." Thomas shook his head ruefully. "Tomorrow the whole town will be talking. Does that bother you?" Faith asked, suddenly uncertain. Thomas considered the question, then surprised her with a slow smile. "No," he said simply. "It doesn't." As the social wound down and families began departing, Thomas helped Faith gather her belongings. "May I walk you home?" he asked. Faith nodded, pleased by the offer. They strolled toward the schoolhouse in the gathering twilight, Daniel skipping ahead, examining interesting rocks and sticks along the way. "He's full of energy," Faith observed, watching the boy. "Never stops," Thomas agreed with affection in his voice. "Exhausts me some days." "Yet you seem happier than when I first met you," Faith noted. Thomas glanced at her. "Do I? Very much so." They reached the schoolhouse steps, where Thomas instructed Daniel to wait by the gate while he said goodnight to Miss Daniels. The boy complied with a knowing grin that suggested he understood more than the adults might wish. "About what I was saying earlier before we were interrupted," Thomas began, his voice low. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" Faith asked. "For making me see there might be life beyond grief." "For your persistence." He took a deep breath. "And to ask if you might consider having dinner at the ranch this Saturday with Daniel and me." Faith smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "I'd like that very much." Thomas nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Good, that's good." He seemed about to say more when Daniel called impatiently from the gate. Thomas sighed, then, in a move that surprised them both, leaned down to press a quick, gentle kiss to Faith's cheek. "Until Saturday," he murmured, then turned and walked away, leaving Faith standing on the steps with her hand pressed to her cheek and her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. The days leading up to Saturday passed with excruciating slowness for Faith. Her students noticed her distraction, exchanging knowing glances when she had to ask them to repeat questions or lost her place in a reading. Daniel, for his part, wore a perpetual grin whenever their eyes met, clearly pleased with the developments between his teacher and his guardian. Saturday finally arrived, crisp and clear. Faith spent more time than she cared to admit selecting her outfit, eventually choosing a sage green dress that she'd been saving for special occasions and arranging her hair. She also baked an apple cake, determined to contribute something to the meal despite Thomas's assurance that she needn't bring anything. Thomas arrived promptly at 4, driving a polished buggy rather than the utilitarian wagon he usually used. He had dressed carefully as well, Faith noted with pleasure, clean-shaven, wearing a pressed shirt and his best vest. "You look lovely," he said simply as he helped her into the buggy, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "Thank you," Faith replied, suddenly shy. "So do you." "Handsome, I mean." Thomas's lips quirked in a small smile as he took the reins. "Daniel's been cleaning the house since dawn, never seen him so concerned with dusting," Faith laughed. "He wants to make a good impression." "As do I," Thomas admitted, glancing at her. The ride to the ranch passed pleasantly, with Thomas pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area's history. Faith found herself relaxing, the initial nervousness giving way to comfortable conversation. At the ranch, Daniel bounded out to greet them, proudly leading Faith inside to show her the preparations he'd made. The dining table was set with what was clearly the best china the ranch house possessed, and wildflowers had been arranged in a jar as a centerpiece. "It looks wonderful, Daniel," Faith praised, delighting in the boy's proud smile. Dinner was a cheerful affair, with Daniel dominating the conversation, eager to share every detail of ranch life with Faith. Thomas watched them interact, his expression softening whenever Faith laughed at one of Daniel's stories or gently corrected his grammar. After the meal, Daniel reluctantly went to complete his evening chores, leaving Faith and Thomas alone. Thomas suggested a walk to enjoy the sunset, offering Faith his arm as they strolled toward a ridge that overlooked the ranch. "It's beautiful here," Faith said, taking in the sweeping vista of grasslands, the distant mountains painted gold and pink by the setting sun. "It is," Thomas agreed, though his gaze was fixed on her rather than the landscape. "Faith, there's something I need to say." Faith turned to face him, her heart quickening at his serious tone. "Yes," Thomas took a deep breath. "When Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. The part where I could care for someone, build a future, feel happiness." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I convinced myself it was better that way, safer. And now," Faith asked softly, "now I find myself thinking about the future again, making plans, wondering." He hesitated, then reached for her hand, his fingers warm as they entwined with hers. "Wondering if you might be part of those plans." Faith's breath caught. "Thomas, I know it's soon," he continued hastily. "We've known each other barely 3 months, and I'm not asking for promises now. Just permission to call on you properly, to see where this might lead." Faith smiled, squeezing his hand. "You have more than my permission, you have my enthusiastic approval." Relief and joy washed across Thomas's face. With gentle deliberation, he drew her closer, one hand rising to cup her cheek. "May I?" he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. Faith nodded, her eyes closing as Thomas lowered his head to kiss her. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft against hers, the contact brief but enough to send her pulse racing. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. "I've wanted to do that since the spring social," he admitted. Faith smiled, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "I've wanted you to." Thomas kissed her again, more confidently this time, his arm slipping around her waist to draw her against him. Faith responded eagerly, her hands resting on his broad chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and blue. Thomas kept his arm around Faith's waist as they walked back to the house, both quiet, absorbing the significance of what had just transpired between them. Daniel was waiting on the porch, his expression shifting from impatience to delight when he observed their closeness. "Are you going to marry Miss Daniels now?" he asked Thomas bluntly. Thomas coughed in surprise while Faith failed to suppress a laugh. "Daniel, that's not a proper question," Thomas admonished, though without real anger. Daniel looked unrepentant. "Well, are you? Because Timmy Miller says his pa says you two have been making eyes at each other for weeks, and that means—" "That's enough, Daniel," Thomas interrupted firmly. "Miss Daniels and I are fond of each other. Beyond that, it's not a topic for discussion right now." Daniel sighed dramatically. "Fine, but I think she should marry you, then she could live here and teach me every day instead of just at school." Faith knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Daniel, things like marriage take time. Mr. Blackwood and I are just beginning to know each other." "But you like him, right?" Daniel persisted. "And he likes you, I can tell." Faith glanced up at Thomas, who was watching them with a mixture of embarrassment and affection. "Yes," she admitted. "I like him very much." This seemed to satisfy Daniel, who nodded sagely. "Good, he's been a lot less grumpy since you started coming around." Thomas rolled his eyes. "Thank you for that assessment, Daniel. Now, it's getting late. Miss Daniels needs to return to town." The ride back to Pine Ridge was quieter, a comfortable silence between them punctuated by occasional conversation. When they reached the schoolhouse, Thomas helped Faith down from the buggy, holding her hand longer than necessary. "I'll call on you next weekend," he said, "if that's acceptable." Faith nodded. "Very acceptable." Thomas leaned down to kiss her once more, briefly but with unmistakable tenderness. "Good night, Faith." "Good night, Thomas." As spring yielded to summer, Thomas became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse. Every Saturday, he would arrive with flowers or a small gift, a book he thought she might enjoy. candies from the general store, once even a kitten he'd rescued from his barn, knowing Faith had mentioned wanting a pet for company. Their courtship progressed with a careful deliberation that Faith found endearing. Thomas was not a man given to impulsive gestures or flowery declarations, but his feelings were evident in 100 small ways: the gentleness of his touch, the way his expression softened when she entered a room, his patient attention to her stories about Boston and her family. Faith, in turn, found herself falling deeper in love with both Thomas and the life he represented. She accompanied him and Daniel on picnics, learned to ride Western style on a gentle mare Thomas provided, and even tried her hand at basic ranch tasks, much to Daniel's amusement. By mid-July, when school was on summer break, Faith was spending most weekends at the ranch. The townspeople had long since accepted their relationship, with Martha Jenkins taking particular credit for having seen it coming all along. One warm evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass, Daniel having been sent to bed, Thomas turned to Faith with unusual seriousness. "I've been thinking," he began, taking her hand in his. "About us, about the future." Faith's heart quickened. "Oh." Thomas nodded, his expression intent. "I love you, Faith, have for some time now. Probably since that blizzard when you showed up at my door, half frozen but determined to help a sick boy you barely knew." Faith smiled, touched by the admission. "I love you too, Thomas." "I know I said I'd never marry again," Thomas continued, his voice low and earnest. "Thought that part of my life was over, but you changed me." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small, velvet-covered box. "So I'm asking if you'd do me the honor of becoming my wife." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single, perfect diamond. Faith's breath caught as Thomas slid from his chair to one knee before her. "Faith Daniels, will you marry me?" Tears of joy blurred Faith's vision as she nodded. "Yes, Thomas, yes, I will." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to kiss her deeply, his arms encircling her with protective tenderness. When they finally parted, both were smiling. "Daniel will be pleased," Faith said, laughing softly. "He's been dropping hints for weeks." Thomas grinned. Subtlety is not the boy's strong suit. His expression grew more serious. "You're sure about this? Life on a ranch isn't easy, especially for someone used to city comforts." Faith touched his face gently. "I've never been more certain of anything. This is where I belong with you and Daniel." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Pine Ridge. Most reactions were positive, though a few eyebrows raised at the relatively brief courtship. Faith wrote to her parents in Boston, inviting them to the wedding and explaining her decision to make her life in Wyoming. Their reply, when it came, was supportive if a bit bewildered by their daughter's choice to marry a rancher she'd known less than 6 months. "They'll understand when they meet you," Faith assured Thomas after reading him portions of the letter. "They just want me to be happy." "And are you?" Thomas asked, a rare moment of vulnerability in his voice. "Happy," Faith leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body. "Completely." They set the wedding date for early September before the fall term of school began. Faith would continue teaching, riding to and from town each day on the mare Thomas had given her, which she'd named Daisy for the wildflowers that dotted the ranch's pastures. The wedding preparations were simple but thorough. Martha Jenkins took charge of organizing the church and reception, while Faith ordered a special dress from a dressmaker in Cheyenne. Thomas, for his part, focused on enlarging the master bedroom of the ranch house and adding bookshelves to accommodate Faith's collection. Daniel threw himself into the preparations with characteristic enthusiasm, proudly announcing to anyone who would listen that Miss Daniels was going to be his new mother. Faith, overhearing him one day, felt her heart swell with love for the boy who had become so dear to her. 2 weeks before the wedding, Faith's parents arrived from Boston, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern as they stepped off the stagecoach. Faith's father, a distinguished professor at Harvard, looked particularly out of place in his formal Eastern attire. "Faith, darling," her mother embraced her warmly. "You look different, healthier, I think." "It's the fresh air and hard work," Faith replied, smiling. "Mother, father, this is Thomas Blackwood, my fiancé, and this is Daniel Parker, who lives with Thomas." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand to Faith's father. "Professor Daniels, Mrs. Daniels, it's a pleasure to meet you both. Faith has told me so much about you." Faith held her breath, watching the interaction. Her father hesitated only briefly before shaking Thomas's hand. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand you're quite successful in the cattle business." "I've been fortunate," Thomas replied modestly. "My ranch is small compared to some, but it's growing steadily." "And you're raising this young man?" Faith's mother inquired, smiling at Daniel. "Yes, madam," Thomas answered. "Daniel came to live with me earlier this year. He's a fine boy." Daniel beamed at the praise, standing straighter beside Thomas. The initial meeting went better than Faith had dared hope. Her parents, while clearly still adjusting to the idea of their daughter marrying a Wyoming rancher, were polite and increasingly warm as they observed the obvious affection between Faith and Thomas. At the ranch, Faith's mother marveled at the comfortable home Thomas had created, while her father was impressed by the extensive library. "You're a reader, Mr. Blackwood?" he asked, surprised. "My late wife was," Thomas explained. "I've continued to add to her collection over the years." "And please call me Thomas." By the end of their first day at the ranch, Faith could see her parents beginning to understand her choice. Her mother pulled her aside as they prepared for bed. "He loves you very much," she observed. "It's evident in the way he looks at you," Faith smiled. "Yes, he does, and I love him, Mother, more than I thought possible after William died." Her mother touched her cheek gently. "Then your father and I are happy for you, dear. It's not the life we imagined for you, but it's clearly the one that brings you joy." The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations. The entire town seemed involved, with women contributing food for the reception, men helping to set up tables and benches in the churchyard, and children creating decorations under Martha's direction. The night before the wedding, Thomas rode Faith back to town, where tradition dictated she would spend her last night as a single woman at the schoolhouse. "Next time I see you, you'll be walking down the aisle," Thomas said as they stood on the schoolhouse steps. Faith smiled up at him. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Thomas admitted with a wry smile. "Not about marrying you, that's the easiest decision I've ever made, just about everything going smoothly tomorrow." Faith laughed softly. "If something goes wrong, we'll face it together. That's what matters, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, drawing her close for a lingering kiss. "I love you, Faith Daniels. Tomorrow can't come soon enough." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Faith dressed in her new gown, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simpler than fashionable Boston weddings would demand, but perfect for a ranch wife in Wyoming. Her mother helped arrange her hair, weaving wildflowers through the honey-brown strands. "You look beautiful, darling," she said, blinking back tears. "Truly radiant." At the church, it seemed the entire population of Pine Ridge had turned out. Faith waited nervously in a small anteroom with her father, listening to the murmur of voices from the sanctuary. "Ready, my dear?" Her father asked, offering his arm. Faith nodded, her heart pounding with anticipation. "More than ready." The music began. Mrs. Wilson at the church's small organ, and the doors opened. Faith's breath caught as she saw Thomas waiting at the altar, tall and handsome in a new black suit, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that tears pricked at her eyes. Beside him stood Daniel, practically vibrating with excitement in his new clothes, beaming as Faith walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply moving. Faith and Thomas had written their own vows, simple declarations of love and commitment that brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, his hands steady as they framed her face. "Mrs. Blackwood," he whispered against her lips, the name a caress. The reception lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and enough well wishes to make Faith's cheeks ache from smiling. As the celebration wound down, Thomas took her hand, ready to go home. He asked, his voice low and intimate. Faith nodded, her heart full. "Yes, let's go home." They slipped away amid cheers and good-natured teasing. Daniel staying behind to spend the night with the mayor's family, a tactful arrangement that brought a blush to Faith's cheeks, when Martha Jenkins winked at her. At the ranch, Thomas surprised Faith by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the entryway. Faith looked around the familiar room, now transformed by the knowledge that it was truly her home. "It feels right," she said softly, "being here with you." Thomas took her in his arms, his kiss deeper and more urgent than those they had shared in public. Faith responded eagerly, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair as he pulled her closer. Later, as they lay entwined in their bed, Thomas propped himself on one elbow to look down at his wife, his expression tender in the soft lamplight. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted, tracing the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "After Sarah died, I was certain that part of me was gone forever." Faith caught his hand, pressing a kiss to his palm. "Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That it does. When you stepped off that stagecoach last winter, I had no idea you'd turn my carefully ordered existence upside down. Do you mind?" Faith asked, smiling up at him. "Not in the slightest," Thomas replied, lowering his head to kiss her once more. "In fact, I'm eternally grateful for it." The years that followed brought changes to the Blackwood Ranch, changes that Thomas, once so resistant to disruption, embraced with surprising enthusiasm. The ranch prospered under his continued careful management, allowing for expansions to the house and barn, additional cattle, and eventually the hiring of more hands to manage the growing operation. Faith continued teaching for 2 more years, riding to and from town each day until the arrival of their first child, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, made the journey impractical. Instead, she established a small school on the ranch itself, initially teaching only Daniel and their daughter, but eventually welcoming children from neighboring ranches as well. Daniel, now legally adopted by Thomas and Faith, grew into a responsible young man with a natural aptitude for ranch management and a love of reading that pleased Faith immensely. By 16, he was Thomas's right hand, trusted with significant responsibilities and showing every sign of becoming a fine rancher in his own right. 4 years after their wedding, Faith gave birth to twins, a boy and girl named Thomas Jr. and Grace, completing their family and filling the once quiet ranch house with noise, laughter, and occasional chaos that Thomas pretended to grumble about but secretly adored. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Faith with a trip to Boston to visit her parents, who had yet to meet the twins. The journey was long and occasionally difficult with 3 young children, but the joy on her parents' faces when they met their grandchildren made every challenge worthwhile. "You've built a beautiful family," Faith's father told Thomas as they watched the children play in the garden of the Daniels' Boston home. "I admit I had my doubts when Faith wrote about marrying a Wyoming rancher she'd known for mere months. I'm pleased to have been proven wrong." Thomas nodded, understanding the older man's initial concerns. "She changed my life," he said simply, "showed me it was possible to begin again after loss." During their stay in Boston, Thomas took Faith to dinner at the finest restaurant in the city, dressed in a new suit that made him look distinguished despite his sun-weathered face and calloused hands. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, raising his wine glass to her. "5 years that have been the best of my life," Faith smiled, her heart full. "And many more to come, I hope." "Many more," Thomas agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I promise till death do us part, remember, and I intend to keep that promise for a very long time." Faith squeezed his hand, remembering the bitter, isolated man she'd first met and marveling at the transformation. Love had healed them both, allowing them to move beyond past losses to build something new and precious together. "When we return home," Thomas continued, "I thought we might build that conservatory you've been wanting, a place for you to grow flowers during the winter months." Faith's eyes lit up. "Really, you've been saying it's an unnecessary expense." Thomas shrugged, a smile playing at his lips. "Perhaps, but it would make you happy, and that's reason enough." 10 years after their wedding, the Blackwood Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. The small school Faith had established had grown into a proper building with 20 students from surrounding ranches and farms. Daniel, now 20, had recently become engaged to Lily Thompson, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, with plans to build his own home on Blackwood land. On a warm September evening, much like the one on which they'd wed, Thomas and Faith sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold behind the distant mountains. Did you ever imagine this? Faith asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. 10 years ago, when you were determined to remain alone for the rest of your life, Thomas chuckled, his arm tightening around her. Not even in my wildest dreams. I'd convinced myself that happiness wasn't meant for me, that I'd had my chance and lost it. And now, Faith prompted, looking up at his face, weathered by sun and wind but still handsome to her eyes. Thomas surveyed their home, their children, the life they'd built together. Now I know that sometimes life offers second chances, if we're brave enough to take them. Faith smiled, pressing a kiss to his cheek. I'm glad you were brave, Thomas Blackwood. It wasn't bravery, Thomas corrected gently. It was you. You showed me that loving again wasn't a betrayal of what I'd lost, but an honor to it, that Sarah would have wanted me to find happiness again. She would be proud of the man you've become, Faith said softly, of the father you are to our children, of the life you've built. Thomas nodded, emotion tightening his throat. I think she would. He pressed a kiss to Faith's temple. And I know with absolute certainty that marrying you was the best decision I ever made, even if I was stubborn about it at first. Faith laughed. You were indeed. The ornery rancher who swore he'd never marry again. Until a certain schoolteacher from Boston made me rethink forever. Thomas finished, smiling down at the woman who had brought light back into his life when he'd thought darkness was all that remained. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their children's laughter echoing across the ranch yard, Thomas and Faith Blackwood held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that had given them both a second chance at happiness.